So welcome everybody to the third conversation in our New Perspectives series celebrating 10 years of New Perspectives in Translation and Interpreting Studies for Routledge. So we, in our first session, we talked to Sherry Simon, in our second to Brian Bear, and today I have the very special privilege and honor of introducing Federico Italiano, who was the author of Translation and Geography, we published in 2014. Federico is a senior researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences and teaches comparative literature at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich and at the University of Innsbruck. He has twice been visiting a professor of translation studies at the University of Graz, and he is currently a senior fellow at the Internationales Forschungszentrum Kulturwissenschaften in Vienna. Federico is also a widely published poet whose work has been translated into a number of languages. Federico, so welcome to our conversation. And I wanted to begin with sort of the opening pages of your book, where you talk about somebody who came from Piedmont in northern Italy. So in Italian terms, you're very much a northerner. You're part of northern Italy. But then when you go to teach in Munich, all of a sudden you become a Zuland, you become a southerner. So this kind of northerner becomes a southerner. Was that kind of experience of kind of spatial displacement and how you got redescribed in a different space, was that what kind of prompted your interest in this notion of the relationship between language, translation, and space?
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I'm very glad to be here and sharing ideas and let's talk about geography and translation, which still is one of my favorite subjects. And yes, Michael, it was a real displacement, and it triggered somehow my interest into this relationship between space and translation. But it was not the only one. I mean, I was already interested very much into literary translation, but I never really thought in the beginning, in those years when I was just working on the idea of literary translation, on what it really means, space for translation, or lived space, or to be somewhere and being translated. So it was a very somehow enlightening experience for me. And as I've written in the book, in these first lines, it was really something like that. I had a feeling to becoming Südländer, as the German as the Germans say, but at the same time it was for me like a paradox, because I was used to be called a northerner in the north-south divide, which is a very typical Italian discourse, because I come from northern Italy. So it was a very strange paradox, and at the same time something that I really was experiencing with a quite amused on the one hand feelings, and on the other kind of yes, more and more politically interested in, because it's a kind of identitarian description you are labeling, you're getting from people around you. And the third element, which quite triggered my interest into the concept of space and translation, it was again something very personal, and it was this kind of being in Germany, which means in Munich, so south of Germany, but still in Germany, so on the other side, on the northern side of the Alps, but being in a place that that is somehow very festive and happy place. Let's put it like that. And Bavarian people enjoy to have parties, and I do come from a place which is a little bit more, I wouldn't say rigid, stiff, but somehow people are very introverts in Novara, in Piedmont. So it was also kind of different perception of this placeness, because I was coming from a rather foggy environment into sunny mountains of Bavaria, and it was not at all what people thought about me. People were almost complaining for me that I left sunny Italy. So it's quite of interesting aspect that come together. But yes, this was one of the reasons I was interested into the relationship between space and in translation. But of course, there are many other which are for me very important. One of them is the concept of orientation, which is very important concept for me, also from a philosophical point of view. But I don't know if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, that's very convenient, because I specifically wanted to ask you a question about this key term of orientation, which you use and you describe, and that notion of orienting yourself and the idea of the orient, the rising sun, and the rising sun kind of illuminates the path before you, so you get a better, clearer idea of where you're going. And you talk about Blumenberg's notion of orientation as one of these kind of foundational metaphors which reveal substructures of thought. So what and of course, there are various ways in which people will define orientation, or they will say that the fundamental process or idea behind orientation is the left-right division, in left-handed, right-handed, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, or it's a more of a temporal rather than a spatial one, which is to do with night and day, light and darkness. So what is your notion or understanding of orientation, or the one that you were trying to pursue in the book?
Well, this is a concept that I started to investigate on just working in, from a perspective of literary translation, because somehow when you translate text, you need your own path through this text. You have to decide a kind of way to maintain a certain coherence in your own translation. So I was just thinking about the text also as a space, and to orientate oneself in the text in a very general way. This is the general way I was talking about in this introduction to translation and geography. It is exactly what you said, a kind of absolute metaphor, and this is the concept used by Blumenberg. For example, like the metaphor of light. This very foundational metaphors we don't even think about anymore as metaphor, but just as concepts which are already done, that have been already there from the beginning. And orientation is one of them. We even forget sometimes when we use this concept orientation, the etymological history of the world is this relationship to the concept of Orient, of East, of also this solar mythology, which is exactly the way we look at one of the probably the most sure cardinal point we have, to look at the sky and look where the sun rises, because it's the only thing that we can surely do. But for example, Kant was one of the first who used exactly this kind of absolute metaphor to conceive his own thinking about orientation in thinking. And he was using exactly this kind of first distinction everybody does between the left and the right hand, but also between light and obscurity. And but on the other side, this kind of distinctions, these spatial distinctions, we almost intuitively process in our everyday life, are connected to a way of mythical thinking that is also something which is very everyday life. If we think about our own way to our favorite bar or a favorite restaurant, or how we get home from a particular district of the town, we have in our mind a very spatial, specific spatial dimension, which is correlated with our own history, with our own experiential history, and that constructs somehow so little mythologies which are our own. And so every time we think of space, we think in a kind of mythology, private mythology, which creates imaginative geographies. And this is exactly the concept that I thought, okay, that's something that I would like to investigate from the perspective of translation, because if we have to communicate our own imaginative geography, so we have to translate them, and that was the real triggering point.
So, if I'm understanding you, Federico, then one of the things that you're sort of taking from what Kant and others were writing about with respect to translation is the connection between orientation and difference. That orientation is only possible if we have some kind of foundational ground of difference, and that as part of that difference, then we inhabit, or what constitutes difference is that our storied spaces are different, that we fill different spaces with different stories. So that is it that when we move then from one storied space to another, we have to completely kind of reorient ourselves. We because we're moving into a different kind of imaginative geography or a differently storied space.
Yes, I couldn't say better, Michael. It's exactly that. You have to reorientate yourself in order to understand the other imaginative geography, the imaginative geography you would like to be part of, or you would like to travel through. And I think that this is exactly this kind of process, the reorientation of our own geographies, or which is at base of this kind of translational dimension. And I was investigating, I'm still investigating, because it's such a huge subject that I think that we still have a lot of things to do in this context. And yes, it's a kind of reorientation, and it's something that you can also investigate not only in your personal experiential experiential context, but also looking at some discourses of the past. I mean, this kind of reorientation is something that has always happened at different levels in literature, in history, and it's something that you can investigate as a literary scholar, not only based on your own psychogeography or your own psychical life, but also looking at the text from the past, and something that I really love to do, because it gives you a hint. How can you understand your own contemporary life in a more profound way? And I think that we have a lot of examples that I didn't investigate. We could still investigate in the sense of reorientations. And for example, I have kind of, I would say that the 7 chapters of my book are all, we could briefly describe them as chapters on reorientation from a translational point of view.
Just before we come on to maybe 1 or 2 specific examples of those kinds of fascinating examples that you give of reorientation in the history of literature, I just wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between one of the primary instruments of geography, which is the map, and the relationship between texts and maps. And I think one of the words that you use in your work is the kind of notion of transmediality. I mean, so you've got the cartic imagination, you've got the verbal imagination, and so so how do you conceive of or think about that relationship, the kind of the translational relationship between maps and words?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. This is a very important question, and I'm working with 2 main concepts in this book, and I'm still working now with them. And both are geographical imagination and cartographical imagination. They are somehow similar, they're cognates, but there's a very important difference between them. So if the concept of geographical imagination can be easily described as imagination of boundaries and geophysical elements with determine the way we think about the body of Earth and so on. The cartographical imagination is something that only exists if we have a medium that support what we call cartographic. So every time that geographic imagination is not only thinking or writing about the Earth, but also where the media support, like a map, for example, or a globus, not only a map. This also, if we're thinking about the globus or the navigational instrument that you always, that you often have in novels. For example, I think about Moby Dick. One of the most important cartographical aspects in the novel is not only the map, but also the different navigational instrument used by Captain Ahab, and so on. So every time that you have this emergence of the very clear medial element of cartography, you can think or at least consider the concept of cartographic imagination. So when we're dealing with the map within a text, we already have a dimension that we should call at least a transmedial dimension, a transmediation or transmedium. Why? Because the map still works as a map within the text. So it is not a relationship between a medium and another one which is fully closed, for example, like the translation, the adaptation of a movie into of a book into a movie, of a novel into a movie, but it's still something that works within another medium. When if a novel is describing, for example, a map, this described map, even if you don't see it as a graphic element, still works as a map in your head. For example, there's an example in my book where I talk about Orlando Furioso, and I'm describing a couple of verses where Ariosto, the author of this epic poem, is telling about a knight flying on a hippogriff from the right side of the globe to the left side of the globe. But, for us, it's quite normal to think about the right and the left side of the globe. But globe, of course, that doesn't have a right or the left side. But if you think cartographically, you see it. You have this north-oriented map, world map, where the right side is probably Asia or Chipangu, Japan, and the left side is England, and where the knight wanted to fly. So in a verse at the beginning of the 16th century, you have this kind of cartographical imagination that translates a map into a text. And it was not evident at the time, because we are talking about an epoch where probably the most famous world map was east-oriented and not north-oriented. So this is what I'm doing, and the book is mostly about exactly this relationship between maps and text, and the way text use a kind of carticity, this affinity between text and map in processing this kind of imagination, of cartographic imagination.
And just taking that notion of direction and maps, and of course, thinking about in the early medieval period that people were very nervous about going to where I currently reside, because they felt if they went too far, they'd literally fall off the edge of the world. But one of the texts that comes from that world, that Western Atlantic seaboard, is the Navigator Sancti Brendani, this travel account attributed to this Irish saint, Saint Brendan, who's sailing off to eventually arrive at the Isle of the Blessed, and so on, the kind of the promised land, and all the difficulties that they face on the way. But you take that particular text, a text that was very, very influential in the medieval period, as you look at what happens in translation, and how the text itself becomes an example of several forms of translation, of directional translation. Do you want to say a word or two about that?
Yes. I would be very happy to talk about the Navigator Sancti Brendani, because it was probably the text where I first put together all this information I was working on the concept of orientation and so on. So and when I stumbled upon this text, which was one of the texts I knew, because I was always very interested into travelogues. It has always been somehow a passion of mine. But I one day, reading it again, the Venetian translation of the Navigator, I noticed that there was something wrong, or not wrong, something different in the constellation of cardinal points. So I noticed that the Venetian translation of the Navigator Sancti Brendani gave us a different kind of direction of the travel. It gave us east-oriented travel, which was exactly the opposite of the original Latin version made by an anonymous Irish writer, an Irish monk, who, of course, from his, I say his because it was probably a man, from his own Atlantic thinking, had to organize in his head and on the page west-oriented sea travel. But we have two different maritime cultures. On the one hand, the west-oriented Irish sea travel, and the Venetian Mediterranean sea maritime imagination, which is, of course, East-oriented, because in the East was the most important, source of power and wealth for Venetian people. But as you said, one of the first aspects of this, let's put it, cultural translation, it's in the original text itself, because already the Latin text of the Navigator Santi Brendiani, which is a Peregrinatio pro Amore Dei, it is already somehow the cultural translation of an anchoritic practice, which we know something about, especially from the eastern part of the Mediterranean, from Syria and Egypt, where many, let's say, saints were knew, because the biographies were written, so hagiographic texts were published, and this kind of anchoritic practices, which were normally geopoetically related to the desert, sand dunes, and very solid spaces, have been translated into this beautiful Hiberno-Latin text, into the liquid, watery dimension of the Irish anchoritic practice. So you already have first big, wonderful poetic translation, which we could call geopoetic translation, from the sand, solid deserts of Eastern Mediterranean anchoritic practice to the watery monk experience of the monks in the west coast of Ireland. And this is the first cultural translation you already in the original, and then, as you said, this was almost a bestseller in the Middle Ages. The Navigator has been translated into different dialects and languages of the time, Norman, French, and German, Venetian, and also Florentine, and so on. So I was very interested into the Venetian version, and when I realized that the cardinal points were somehow different, I thought I have to write about it. I have to write, and apparently I was also the first one who really noticed this paradox. This.
What's very interesting as well is which you described so well, is the two visions of paradise. That there's a kind of fairly sober description when they arrive at this, the Isle of the Blessed, and so in the Hiberno-Latin text, it's there are rivers, there are trees. It seems like a nice place, and the Venetian translator felt that this wasn't a particularly exciting vision of paradise, so they need to kind of up the ante. So they begin to describe in these very dramatic and highly colored terms what an amazing place this was, because if you're going to encourage Venetian traders and merchants to travel east, well, you better make sure that they feel it's worth their while. So it's lovely the way in which that gets kind of colored in a particular way. But just in the context of that, we've talked a lot about orientation. We talked about the Cartic imagination, but there's also this notion of navigation itself, which you particularly link this to translatio imperi, that the sort of the relationship between, I suppose, navigation and empire. Do you want to say a word or two about this, about how these notions meet each other?
Yes. You're perfectly right, and it's start with the navigatio, the thinking about cardinal points and channels using probably another, let's put it like that, another absolute metaphor almost, navigation, as also some a conceptual structure of the concept of empire. And in the Venetian translation of Navigator, we have this what you now described, this interpolation within the translation. In the effectual translation, you have 3 or 4 pages more than the original, which were added by the translator, the anonymous Venetian translation, just to induce something like something marvelous, to fascinate and convince Venetian people to start sailing again, because it was a period of laziness from an economical point of view. But navigation is also something which is normally very coded and mastered by central organization, which is, as you said, especially between the 16th and the 18th century, an empire. First the Habsburg, and then the British Empire, or the French king, and so on. And this is something that I really love to investigate in this chapter, where I was talking about, for example, the Ariosto, of course, but more specifically, there's a chapter about the Naufragios, which is a Spanish text, also of the 16th century, written by Cabeza de Vaca, who was part of one of these conquistador travelers to the newly discovered or newly found territories beyond the Atlantic. And one of these, the first travel he did, the expedition had suffered a shipwreck, and he started to walk the whole southern part of today United States. So it was the first account, if you will, of this part of the United States and Mexico. And what is writing in this text of his is somehow a kind of Christian topography of a region which was completely unknown to the Europeans, and marking this region with symbols and signs and meanings of Christian Europe. So it was somehow the translation, and that's the way I try to investigate it and to analyze it, the translation of spatial dimension, spatial and cultural dimension, this part of today United States and Mexico, into a Christian imperial topography, and also part of a bigger program, which is normally known as Translatio Imperii et Studi, which is not the first one. I mean, there are many examples of it, but it surely is one of the most interesting aspects of the Translatio Imperii, which is something which is exactly for the Habsburg move towards the West in this, especially in this context. But you also have another kind of Translatio Imperii, which I found very interesting in the book, and I think that it's not obvious to see like that. And I don't know if you want to talk about it, but there's a chapter about Jules Verne, where the Translatio Imperii, it's also something like a Translatio Mari, but I don't want to haste, and so please tell me if you want to take another subject.
No, please say word. Yeah.
Yes, because this is something that I found very interesting, and this novel that probably many now listening have read in French or in English translation, it is somehow, this, at least the way I try to understand it and reading it, a translation of Odysseus' Mediterranean travel within or into an ocean wide spatial dimension, into the travels of Nemo, which is the Latin word for nobody. As you know, one of the names that Odysseus himself gave himself to tricks, to trick Polypheme. How do you say Polypheme in English? Polyphemus. And so this is something that I try to explain. This translatio imperi becomes a kind of translatio mari, where we have another kind of prince or king changing his own territories into this aquatic universe of the seven seas, and we have a interesting aspect in this translation, many layers, many levels of possible correspondences, where Jules Verne used, for example, the concept which is very typical of the culture of this contemporary cultural dimension, which was the Flannerie, and we have a scene in which this, let's say, newly very modern way of leaving the city is translated into the subaqueous world of Captain Nemo, which is also somebody who loves to take trips in the ocean and look at the beautiful phenomena, underwater phenomena, and so on. And so many aspects of the solid world have been translated into the watery world of Captain Nemo, creating something that I try to define as a translatio maris.
And do you think, to some extent, Federico, that it's been in the Western tradition, that the notion of translatio itself, which is deeply spatial in the way in which the term is constructed, which is not the case in other languages and other cultures. There are different, often non-spatialized ways of viewing translation. That this has to some extent facilitated that connection between translation and the geographical imagination, because to some extent translation itself in the Western acceptance of the term is deeply spatialized.
Yes, I think you're really touching the point, which is again something very etymological, but I love etymology. So yes, you're completely right. The concept of translatio is first of all so related to a very spatial process, the movement of something in space from one place to another. For example, there is a whole genre of literary texts in the Middle Ages, which is known as translationes, and they were mostly narratives, or so accounts about how determined relics of saints were found in a place and then transported into another, and it was called translatio. And this process of translatio had many different phases. You have the inventio, which is the moment where the relics of the saints were found, and then at the end you have the moment where you pose this position when you pose the relics into the determined place, which was mostly a church or an abbey, because obviously these relics were linked to kind of particular, religious but also temporal power. If you had the relics, your abbey or your church would have more, prestige, and you would probably earn more money. So this was a kind of very temporal thing at the end. But at the same time, it is like every translation, also a ghost story. So translation, we could call translation somehow also like every translation is a kind of ghost story. So these translations are not so far away from a very modern concept of translation. But yes, you're completely right. So already exactly in the beginning of the concept of translation in the English language, because the word in Italian, for example, is different. Is traduzione from tradutio, which was coined a little bit later by Bruni in the Renaissance. But at least in the history of the concept in the English language, the spatial dimension, I would say, is very important, deciding almost symbolically deciding element.
I love your idea there of the link between translatio, relics, and then translation itself as a kind of a haunting, that anthology that Derrida talks about, there is that sense of. One of the other writers that you discuss in your book is Antonio Tabucchi, and is particularly it's Donne di Porto Pim e altre storie from, I think it's 1983, and you talk about there the way in which the kind of the archipelago of the Azores somehow gets sort of transmediated into the text itself, and you also have this notion of translational mimesis. Maybe you might want to say a word or two about that.
Yes, I would be happy. Yes, you're right. I think this was one of the, for me, from a theoretical point of view, most fascinating moment of writing this book, because I had to somehow understand the way a writer is working with this very particular land and ocean scape, which is an archipelago in the middle of the ocean, and somehow imitating or translating the archipelago into its own writing, which is something fascinating. But at the same time, you have with a very tiny little book, which is 50 pages, and you can read it in 2 hours. In 2 hours, you read the whole book, and I found it. Well, it's one of my favorite books by Tabucchi, of course, but it's one of the most interesting examples, in my opinion, of how translation also work in a very intralinguistic way. So it's in one language as well. And it's normally when we think about translation, we always think at least about 2 languages, which is clear. This is normally the way we talk about translation, the way we think about literary translation or interpreting. So 2 languages, and we have to negotiate between them. But what does it happen if we have one language in which you want to recount a story, in which you want to seduce a person, but at the same time, in this language, you have to somehow let transpire other languages, real languages, or geopoetical aspects. And so this tiny book was a wonderful example, because you had this presence of the Portuguese, which is spoken in the Azores. So the way Tabucchi, for example, helps the reader entering this Portuguese insularity dimension of the Azores through using sometimes Italian formulation which are a little bit strange, where you can hear something like another language behind them, or just to using very rarely original terms of the Portuguese, idiom spoken in the Azores. And these are different level of what very good comparative scholar from Israel, Sternberg, called translational mimesis. I don't want to yet enter now into this because it's very complicated and it's very fascinating. It's just one article that I'm quoting. It's a very dense and fascinating article. It was written in the 80s, so it's already more than almost 40 years old, and but it's still something that we can work with, and I would really still advise everybody working with literature and translation to give a look to this Sternberg's article, because we should update it. So we have to think about it. We already have 40 years more of translation studies, so we are before that than that. But the idea of translational mimesis is still very actual, I think, and is one way of understanding the polylinguality or idiomatic dimensions of a text, and this help.
I think it's a very productive concept, particularly when you think of the way we have to rethink the notion of the intercultural and the multicultural in terms of the more than human, and how then more than human, how we translate this in terms of the symbolic languages that are at our disposal. I think that's another dimension or another potential application of the notion of translation mimesis. At this stage, of course, I would be very keen to invite you, the people who are listening in to our conversation, because we would like to broaden it. So if anybody has questions or comments on anything that Federico has said, then we would very much welcome your questions or your comments. I have a question here, which is from Matt Valler. So Matt says, thank you, Federico and Michael, for fascinating conversation. He says, I wonder about the extent to which geography is possible as a more than human practice, in which translation can help displace anthropocentrism. For example, other species have important navigational capabilities, sometimes far beyond those of the human. Various species orient themselves differently depending which aspect of their Umwelt is most determinate for survival. Many species practice a kind of cartographical making of territory, which profoundly affects, indeed orients their behavior. As we consider translation and geography, do you think we need to address the disciplinary definition of geography in order to address ways which geography's human-centric orientation might actually restrict the possibilities of translation? So maybe nicely picking up on something that we're beginning to allude to there. So Federico, would you respond to Matt Valler's?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Matt, for this wonderful question, which is already in itself a kind of micro essay you have proposed now, and I think you are perfectly right. And we should start, and at least we don't have more excuses since 2000 and 2017 when Michael published Eco-Translation, to avoid or to forget non-human translational dimension. And this is something that I'm working on it now. I'm trying to, let's say, expand my own concept of relationship between maps and text, geography and literature, towards these this relationship between human and non-human. As you said, we could also, from a very human perspective, consider some spatial practices by animals as in analogy to maps or cartographical thinking. We should pay attention in doing that, in produce this analogy to not overlap, let's say, something which is very animal and beautifully so with very human practice, which is the cartographic process. But on the other hand, I would say, yes, we could do that, especially if you think about the spatial skills in reading the territories by, for example, oaks or the prairie dogs or different kind of birds that normally translate their own language into the language of a cognate species in order to warn them that a cat is coming along. And there are some translation of this sort, translation which have undoubtedly a spatial dimension. So I think that we could surely expand and update this translation and geography work I've done into new ecological perspective that help us to understand the habitats of these different forms of life.
There's a question here from Andrea Bercantino. I found the chapter on Tabucchi particularly interesting because translation is used in Donna di Portopin as a narrative device, and the narrator himself acts as a translator. I'd like to ask Federico Italiano whether this happens also in other words by Tabucchi and what significance this might have for the author. So whether it exists in other texts by Tabucchi.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Andrea. And yes, of course, we have a lot of translational mimesis in Tabucchi's books. Sostene Pereira, for example, probably the most important novel by Tabucchi could be understood from this translational mimesis point of view. Translational mimesis at the end is nothing more and nothing less than a way to understand how you can imitate another language, or you can produce the effects of another language, or show the translational moments within a fiction through the instruments that belong only to one language. So to show multiculturality and multilinguality within one language. This is exactly what happens very often in many novels by Tabucchi. And so Sostene Pereira is one of them, but almost every book which is related to Portugal and Lisbon by Tabucchi could be read from this perspective.
There is a question from from Maria Mendes Galvão. The paper you mentioned polylingualism as reality and translation as mimesis. This is the when we were talking earlier about translational mimesis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly this one. Yeah.
Just to confirm that. I would have to say, and this is, I think I would be expressing, I feel, the feelings of a lot of the participants, that this has been a fascinating conversation, Federico, and that it itself, I think, has been a very beautiful example of a kind of navigatio through the book, through your own thinking. And in terms of orientation, I think we couldn't have hoped for a better guide. I mean, I was going to ask you a question about translation as disorientation, but I think we'd have needed another hour to explore all of the ways in which we could think about that.
Yeah, that would have been great. Disorientation as translation would be also a wonderful subject.
There's a great deal to be said about that particular practice. So just once again, on behalf of everybody taking part, who's listened in, I just want to thank you, Federico, and to wish you all the very best in your future projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here and paying attention to our conversation.
So for those of you who enjoyed today's conversation and who want to know more about the events in the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, if you go to our website, tcd.ie/literary-translation, you will get all of the information that you need. We're also present in various forms of social media. For those of you who are particularly interested in what we do and would like to support our activities, you can become a friend of the Centre, and you'll find all the details on this on the TCLCT website /literary-translation/friends. So thank you once again for coming along this lunchtime, and we look forward to seeing you after the summer in September, where my next guest in the series will be the migration and translation scholar, Moira Ingaleri. Thank you.